story, you may think that my punishment was fitting. When you read the story, you may believe that I got exactly what I deserved. But what you should remember is that my actions were the actions of a child, actions that were judged by someone of a nearly godlike stature, and levied against an 8-year-old girl who may not have fully grasped the consequences of her actions. I believe I should have been punished. I even believe I should have been punished harshly. But I do not believe I should have been made to suffer for 30 years of my life because of the actions of an 8-year-old girl. It sits, even now, on my mantelpiece, glaring at me like some disquieting idol. And even as I sit in my cold apartment, I can feel its hate. I'm rambling. Let me start from the beginning. When I was 7 years old, I had the worst year of my life. My mother died on Christmas Day after a long battle with cancer. My father was always at work, always busy, and never had time for me, which meant my mother and I were very close. When she had gotten sick, I had immediately spent every waking moment I could right by her side at the hospital. Dad was busy, too busy for his dying wife and his hurting daughter, and it was up to me to watch her slip away over the course of 9 months. I was there in her room when she died, pushed up against the wall as the doctors and nurses tried their best to revive her. And by the time my father got there, I had been sitting and crying by my mother's deathbed for 2 hours. My mother had been my sole guardian, my staunch caretaker, and her absence had left me numb and spiteful. I was mad at many things in my life, but above all else, I was mad at Santa Claus. As a child, we believed Santa to be an all-powerful totem of the holidays. If you write a letter to Santa, he will bring you your heart's desire, and he will make any wish a reality. As adults, we know better, but as children, we believe that Santa Claus is the genie from Aladdin, mixed with Jesus Christ himself, and his power around the holidays is unwavering and unarguable. In my 7-year-old mind, if I had asked him to save my mother, and he hadn't, then it was because he didn't want to. This turned me into a mean and spiteful 8-year-old. My father brought a new woman home, one of his secretaries from the office named Cindy. Suddenly, she was sleeping in my mother's bed, moving her things into my mother's house, and replacing my mother in almost every way. Looking back through the lens of time, Cindy was a very nice lady, and if I'd given her a chance, she would have probably made a very good mother for me. Cindy cooked my meals, she cleaned the house, she tried her best to be my friend, and I gave her nothing back but hate. My mother, the focal point of my life, had died after all. To have this woman in her house, sleeping in her bed, and even wearing her clothes, was an affront. I told her that she was worthless daily, told her I hated her, told her she would never come close to being my mother, and in spite of all that, she tried to love me. They got married 6 months after my mother died. I spent the first 3 months of their marriage making their lives a living hell. I refused every meal Cindy made for me. I destroyed any room I was left alone in, and then lied and said I had no idea how it had gotten that way. I went out of my way to inconvenience her, telling her I needed things for school or would really like this one particular thing in my nicest, sweetest voice, and then degrading or right out refusing to take anything she brought back. Sometimes I would destroy the gifts she gave me right in front of her. When she got me a beautiful dress for fall, a dress I would have actually liked to have worn, I tore it to pieces as she and my father watched, and then stormed to my room and slammed the door. I knew, you see, that I was safe from punishment, no matter what I did. Father never cared what I did, as long as I didn't do it in his office. And since Mother had always been responsible for the house and the children, he expected Cindy to take me in hand, a task she was unsuited for. Cindy was more prone to tears than screams in the face of my misbehavior, but something was happening that even I hadn't foreseen, and it changed my antics forever. In October, Cindy became pregnant. By November, it was official, and my father was ecstatic at the idea of another child. This confused me because he never shown the slightest interest in me at any point. Cindy was immediately the center of his universe, and he hired a maid to clean and cook and look after me. I don't remember her name, but we went through 3 before December because of my antics. I made their lives a living hell, and whatever my father was paying them was clearly not enough to put up with me. The last one, I think her name was Rosemary, didn't speak English, but had a way about her that told me she was not going to leave because of a brat like me. I can remember being picked up in those 2 large arms and carried to my room as I kicked and bit and screamed. She would deposit me on the floor and lock my door so I couldn't escape and ruin her work. She knew how the house worked too, it seemed, and she knew that my timeouts wouldn't be commented on by Cindy or my father. By December 1st, I had had enough of Cindy and her constant attention. The baby only made me hate her more, and as people continued to shower her with attention, my hatred burned hotter and hotter. Rosemary had started keeping a closer eye on me as Cindy's pregnancy continued, but she needn't have bothered. I wasn't what you would call a planner, and when my chance came, I almost missed it. Looking back on it as an adult, I realized just how cruel I was at this moment. Cindy wanted nothing but a child that would love her, something I was never going to do. And the baby was her way of making my mother's house her home too. I couldn't have that. I was at the top of the stairs playing with dolls when Cindy started up with a basket of laundry. Normally this would be Rosemary's job, but the maid had caught a cold and my father had given her the week off so she didn't make Cindy sick. Cindy was not supposed to be doing chores. She was under orders to take it easy and not strain herself. But she was trying to pick up a little so Rosemary wouldn't have such a heavy workload when she came back. She came tottering up the stairs, basket obscuring her view, and I suddenly had a plan to make this all go away forever. I picked up my Barbie dream car and placed it precariously on the top step where I knew she'd step on it. I was young, but don't think for a second I was naive. I knew a fall down the stairs would likely kill her, and if it didn't, it would likely get rid of the baby forever. She was midway up when a voice in my head tried to talk me out of this. You shouldn't hurt her. It's not okay to hurt people. My conscience always spoke to me in my mother's voice, but I was doing this for her. Couldn't she see that? You're going to risk killing her and her baby because of something your father did? I didn't care. I hated her too much. You're going to get in a lot of trouble for doing it. That made me think for a moment, but by then, it was too late. Her house-slippered foot came down on the car, and I watched her fall backwards down the stairs with a loud scream. The clothes went flying everywhere, and as she fell, I saw her wrap her arms around her belly to protect it. She curled in a ball as she fell, and when she hit the first step, I knew she had broken something. She hit 3 more steps before coming to rest on the bottom step, still hugging her stomach as she lay crying, and the laundry basket covered her as it came to rest over her head and torso. There she lay, in a puddle of clothes and carpet, and from my vantage point, I could see the first thin trickles of blood as they coursed out from underneath. The ambulance arrived in time to save her. Dad had been at the office when Rosemary called him. She had come running in about 5 minutes after Cindy had fallen and called the ambulance after making sure I was okay. She sat with Cindy at the bottom of the stairs, cradling her head and talking to her in that too-fast Spanish she always used when it was just the 2 of them. I sat at the top of the stairs, surveying my handiwork, but Rosemary wouldn't let me come down the couple of times I tried. Rosemary was never fooled about what had happened, and she always looked at me with secret knowledge to the few more times we had reason to be together. Dad beat the ambulance home, but only just. He rode in the ambulance with Cindy. thanking Rosemary for coming over so suddenly, and left me with the housekeeper while he went to see about his new wife and new child. Rosemary started dinner, and I played in my room, and some time later, my father came home. He called both of us to the living room, giving Rosemary the honor of joining in on the news, and filled us in on Cindy and the baby. He told us that Cindy was going to stay in the hospital for a while. She had broken several bones, scraped her back up pretty badly, and had possibly injured her spine. The doctors weren't sure how badly she was hurt, but they did say that she had lost the baby. Rosemary cried a little, but I didn't. I had wanted this to happen, but now that it had, all I could feel was numbness. I had killed something, not a bug or anything, but a real person, and I was no longer sure how I felt about it. I left before he was done talking, but he didn't seem to mind. How quickly things would change. Dad went to the hospital early the next morning. He was on his way out the door when I reminded him that he promised to take me to see Santa. It was a promise he had made days ago, a promise I believed he'd forgotten, but when I reminded him of it, I just put enough wine on it to make it sound like it was something I'd been looking forward to. I knew there was no Santa, of course. Back then, I thought I knew so much. But I knew that the mall would be crowded and it would force him to spend time with me. At the end of the day, I guess all I wanted was my father to show me he cared. He asked Rosemary to take me instead, and then he was off to see Cindy in the hospital. We rode to the mall in the town car as a palpable silence hung around us. "What are you going to say to St. Nicholas?" she asked, conversationally. "There is no Santa Claus, silly. I'm too old to believe in such things." She was quiet for a few seconds before almost whispering, "You are very wrong." "What?" I asked, shocked out of my pounding huff. No adult had ever contradicted me, not even my mother. And to be contradicted by the help was just unthinkable. "I said that you are wrong. Just because you do not believe in something doesn't mean it isn't so. It matters not whether you believe in a thing or not, only whether or not it believes in you." She spoke matter-of-factly in her thick Spanish accent. I turned away, ignoring her, and pretending she didn't exist. I was a spoiled brat, a naughty child that needed a lesson in how the world worked. I didn't know it then, but this lesson would begin sooner rather than later. This lesson would be the only lesson worth learning. We waited in line for an hour and a half. Rosemary had walked me to the middle of the crowded mall. Shoppers moving to and fro, and families laughing as they moved from shop to shop, all while Christmas music played in the background. Santa's stage had been set up in front of the big fountain in the middle of the mall, and it looked just as goofy and phony as it always did. It was a long snake of children that trailed away from it and curved around it like a magic circle. Rosemary sat on a nearby bench and told me to stand in line. I'm much too old to see him, but if you would receive his judgment, then you must wait. I fidgeted nervously as I waited, throngs of happy families crowding around me, and sighed as the line moved slower and slower. Why was I waiting in this line? I didn't believe in Santa Claus. If Santa's had been real, he'd have saved my mother. Even if I had still believed, this is just going to be some half-drunk fat guy that they stuffed into a suit, who smelled like a little kid pee and barely talked. It was ridiculous to stand here and wait for my turn to sit on the old faker's lap. But despite that, I couldn't force myself to leave. Rosemary's words had somehow moved me, and it felt more like I was waiting for a confessional than a turn on Santa's knee. When I finally neared the front of the line, I could see that my assumption had been wrong. This here Santa was not a fat man with a cloth beard or some homeless man with a tangled mess of hair. He was dressed all in red, and his suit looked homemade, as opposed to a store-bought one. His beard was a fluffy white bulge of soft-looking hair, and on his round little nose sat a pair of tiny spectacles. His boots looked old and battered. His face was a patchwork of laugh lines. and he practically oozed with good cheer and holiday spirit. The elves, teenagers usually dressed in green smocks and pointy shoes, had been replaced with actual little people, and their costumes were perfect to the last detail. From their pointy shoes to their pointy ears, the whole crew made a jolly, happy scene, and I didn't see one child act scared or unsure of the laughing stranger. When it was my turn, however, the mood seemed to change. The elf who came to get me took one look at my face and almost sneered. His happy, laughing face became something almost contemptuous, and as he led me to the jolly old man, I was affixed with the laughing eyes and greeted by the rosy voice, but his face changed as the elves had. He wasn't mad. I saw no anger on his face, but it became almost mournful, disappointed. He allowed me into his lap, and I was surrounded by the smell of old cinders, gingerbread, a woodsy animal smell, and freshly fallen snow. But his eyes were still that of a disappointed parent. It was as though he were ashamed to see me in my current state. "Hello, Abigail. How do you know my name?" I was startled for a moment. He smiled, that slightly troubled smile, and answered, "Because I'm Santa Claus. It's my job to know all the children." "Of course," I said, sighing a little. If this guy wanted to play his part, then I'd play along, I guess. "Well then, you probably already know what I want for Christmas." "I do, but I know you're only getting one thing for Christmas this year." I laughed. I couldn't help it. He was just so full of crap. My tray at home was stacked with presents. I knew enough to know that everything I'd asked Dad for was there. This man didn't know me after all. If I wanted something, I got it, and that was all there was to it. I wondered briefly if Rosemary had told him to scare me a little. He pressed a small package into my hand. "I have a present for you. Something very special. It's something we only give to certain children." It was a small red box with a simple bow on top. It was about the size of a small ring box, and when I touched it, I could feel a small electric charge run through me. I nearly dropped it, but managed to hold on to it as the surprise turned back into malice. A token gift with no real meaning from a mall Santa with no real power. Yes, I'm sure it's wonderful and unique, and that I won't see a dozen or so of them in the parking lot on the way out," I said as I hopped off his lap. "Merry Christmas, Santa," I said as I walked towards the exit. "Merry Christmas, Abigail," he said, almost too low for me to hear. And then he was greeting the next child, and I left. I didn't open the box that day. I forgot about it until Christmas Eve, and though I must have seen it under the tree, I didn't remember bringing it out of the car. Rosemary was silent on the car ride home, but she kept shooting glances at my present, and then looking away quickly before she thought I'd noticed. She probably expected me to rip it open and see what Santa had given me, but I didn't care what it was. I kept thinking back on the whole experience and couldn't help feeling unnerved. He had just been a mall Santa after all, but something about him had seemed like more than that. He had almost seemed real to me. The days came and went. Dad spent more and more time at the hospital with Cindy, something he'd never done for Mom. And Rosemary and I found ourselves more and more often spending time at home together. We didn't suddenly become friends or anything, but many afternoons were spent with me on the couch watching TV, and her in the kitchen cooking or cleaning the house and singing to herself. She was a patient woman, and after a few days of making life hard for her, I stopped completely. I would just sit listlessly on the couch or lie on my bed and read, and now it almost seemed like I was waiting for something to happen. On Christmas Eve, something did. Rosemary was staying the night. Dad was at the hospital with Cindy as usual, and if she hadn't been, I would likely have died. The fire marshal's report says that at 1:35, the outlet plugged into the tree shorted out and set fire to the large pile of presents underneath the tree. Rosemary was asleep in the guest bedroom when the fire started, and upon smelling the smoke, she woke me and the two of us left the house as the living room blazed. We dialed 911 from a neighbor's house, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. Rosemary and I watched the townhouse burn down, watched the house collapse in on itself, and watched in silence as everything I'd ever known was consumed. I lost everything that night. All my clothes, all the pictures I had of my mother, all the dresses that she'd made for me, all the cards she'd written to me, and all the books she'd read me as I drifted off to sleep. All of it was ash and December wind, and when Rosemary wrapped me in a hug, I didn't feel capable of returning it. I was in shock for quite some time. When they brought me to the hospital, my father finally came to check on me. He didn't stay long once the doctors told him I was unharmed, which left Rosemary and I alone in the ER room. The police and the firefighters came to talk to me then. The fire was deemed an accident, and everything in the house was a complete loss. These weren't the words they used with me, of course. They were sympathetic and told me that local charities were collecting clothes, food, and toys for my family in this time of need. One of the firefighters also told me, with a smile, that not everything had been lost in the fire. He reached into his coat and handed me a small package that had been sitting under my tree for nearly a week. The small red package with the simple bow that the mall Santa had placed in my hands. I just held the box for a while. It was completely undamaged by the fire. Not even the shiny ribbon used to make the bow had been damaged. But when I looked at it, I already knew this was no normal gift. Rosemary was looking at me as I held it, and she seemed to know, too, what I would find when I opened the box. Might as well open it, child. Holding off won't do any good. Inside the box was a single lump of coal. I've had it tested several times over the years. It's a lump of pure coal, unrefined and unproduced, made with what I now think must be pure magic. It left no stains inside the box. It left no residue on my hands, and over the years I found it to be indestructible. It was the only thing I received that Christmas, and to be honest, it was enough. My life was never the same after that day. Cindy was brought to our new house on January 10th. It wasn't as grand as our old house, not even close, but it was ours. Father's time at the hospital had meant that his business had suffered, and so too did his finances. Cindy's medical stay was costing him a fortune, and so she had to come home. My medical expenses were costing him quite a lot, and I hadn't stayed long in the hospital either. Rosemary still cooked and cleaned, but Father seemed always on the verge of firing her. He didn't want to. He felt she had changed his daughter somehow, but we simply didn't have the money to pay her. Cindy needed Rosemary, however. Cindy was still nearly catatonic, even after weeks in the hospital. Something had snapped in her after losing the baby, and now she did little more than stare at the wall or soil herself. She would take food if it was fed to her, and she would drink water if it was dribbled in her mouth, but she wouldn't move, and she wouldn't talk. Rosemary would often sing to her, something soft in Spanish, as she combed her hair or bathed her, and Cindy seemed to like it when Rosemary was there. It didn't matter, though. Rosemary had bills too, and ultimately needed a job as much as anyone. 2 weeks after Cindy came home, Father had to let Rosemary go. I met her at the door and begged her to stay. I had come to like her in the time after the fire. We had come to an almost friendly place. My rage and anger seemed meaningless now, and I didn't want her to leave. She was often the only person in the house who seemed real to me, alive, and without her, the house would seem very empty. She bent down on one old knee and favored me with a smile. I know things seem hard now, but you must be strong, my dear. You have no idea how much worse things will become. How do you know? I whispered, and there was no anger in my words, only a child's terrified curiosity. She closed her eyes. When I was a girl, I had a younger sister named Maria. She was so beautiful, and everyone loved her. I was very plain looking, very common, and I was angry that my little sister got so much more attention than me. So one day, I pushed her into a well on our property. She drowned in that well, drowned as I stood and watched. And when they found her, they asked me what I knew. I told Father I knew nothing, and it was believed to be an accident. That Christmas, I received my own red box, and she reached into her apron and pulled out a large black rock, just like the one I had upstairs in my room. I received my punishment from him. My father's livelihood was his farm and his ranch, and in the next year, I saw his cows die of sickness. A flood killed my mother and siblings. His crops dwindle, and his money dried up. By the end of his life, he was a hired hand for a rancher who had been his greatest rival, and after a horse threw him and killed him, I left for America with nothing but the clothes on my back. I do what I can now, in my old age, to make amends for the sins of my youth. You must do the same. I never saw her again after that, but she had been right. My father couldn't turn his business around and was forced to sell his assets. With no one to take care of her, I was forced to be Cindy's caregiver and try my best to use it as an opportunity to make amends for what I'd done. Father sank into depression and started drinking. Who could blame him for the drinking, I suppose? He had a failed business, a dead first wife, a cold daughter, and a current wife who was a little better than a vegetable. He would fly into rages, and when he did, no one was safe from his screaming mouth or his flailing fists. I could forgive him for the drinking. I could forgive him for the rages. But the night he climbed into my bed when I was 13, I decided I would never forgive him for that. 3 years I would leave home forever, unable to take the abuse any longer. The cold followed me, however. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it would always be waiting for me as a reminder of my sins. It's been 20 years now since that Christmas. I live in a dingy apartment with neighbors who are either too stoned or too wrapped up in their own problems to notice me. I never had a job longer than a year, or a relationship that didn't end with me filling out a police report. I've been banned from the local mall, several local malls, many times for many reasons, but the most common one is accosting mall Santas, looking for the real one among the imposters. I've never found him. I never found anyone but the sods or the creeps I spoke of with a child's assuredness. I see him sometimes. It's always in December, always as the first snow falls. I'll be on the street, walking to work or just walking to get out of my apartment. And there he is on the other side of the street or at the end of the block. He's dressed in the same red suit and cap, the same scuffed old boots, and the same little glasses perched on his nose. He never says a word, just lays a finger on the side of his nose and smiles his sad smile at me. I always run to him, always trying to get to him before he disappears. But when I'm done dodging traffic or knocking people out of my way, he's always gone, and I'm always left crying as people stare at me like I might be crazy. While the cold does curse my life, it also gives me one gift, if you can call it a gift. When I was 13, right after my father slipped into bed with me for the first time, I waited until he was asleep and walked to the cabinet where I knew he kept his guns. I took out his revolver, made sure it was loaded, and put it to my temple. If he'd done it once, I knew he'd do it again, and I wasn't going to live in a home where that was my life. I closed my eyes that were dry as the desert, and steeled myself as I pulled the trigger. The cylinder turned, and the hammer fell, but the gun did not report. I pulled the trigger 5 more times, but nothing happened. I put fresh bullets in the gun and tried again, but nothing happened. Finally, I put the gun away and slept on the couch. When I was 15, I tried to jump off the roof of my house. I jumped headfirst from the roof over the driveway. I wanted my death to be assured. I didn't want to wake up in a hospital bed with a broken neck and no way to escape my father. Cindy was still alive then, still catatonic, but still alive, and that my death would leave her at his mercy. I couldn't find it in myself to care anymore. I just wanted the hurting to stop. I came to on the lawn with a sore back and a scrape on my bottom. I tried many other methods through the years, but none of them worked. Someone always finds me. Something always fails. The ambulance always gets there in time, and my life is always saved. Whatever magic the coal has that ruins my life also helps preserve it. Of this I am sure. Whatever lesson I am learning from my sin is one that will go on for a good long time. I'm writing this tale in hopes that it might save others from my fate. Let your children know, let your friends know, that the songs aren't just songs. We threaten our children with coal, but we don't understand it. We have forgotten that Santa Claus doesn't reward the just. We say songs about how he sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake. But we have forgotten that these things are fact. The coal sits on my desk as I write this. A black-hearted reminder of the hasty actions of a child. And no matter what I do to it, it will follow me forever. So never forget that which sees you when you're sleeping. Remember, always he who knows when you are awake. For he knows when you've been bad or good. So be good, for goodness sake. As a coal burns, as a coal gives heat, so too does the heat destroy. Coal can sustain a fire, and a fire can be a tool of destruction. As you act in haste, so too does fire. And never doubt that his fire will scour that which you hold dear. So when you lay down to sleep, pray for only the joys of Christmas. Pray for peace and goodwill towards men. And pray that you never feel the jagged edges of coal in your stocking.